It's Mari McInerney from Croakey here, and I'm talking to Indigo Daya at the very close of the VIMIAC conference for the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. You were the keynote speaker, a very, very popular, powerfully moving speaker. Indigo, rather than try and interrogate the whole of your speech, could you just talk about some of the main points you wanted to bring across here for consumers and the consumer workforce to think about?
Sure, Marie.
Part of that might be that I don't call it the consumer workforce.
It might be. I think that's still up for debate. There was a lot of stuff that I covered, but I think that the heart of what I was talking about were things that I've learned over recent years as I've been in very different advocacy roles, most recently in government, but also in the sector as well. And I guess, at the heart of what I was talking about is that we've done a lot in the consumer movement, which includes those of us who work in consumer or survivor roles or peer roles, but many more of us who don't work in paid roles, who contribute as well. And I guess the heart of that message is that I don't think we've done enough. And I put myself in that space as well. I thought until the last couple of years that we'd been very strong in delivering messages about what's not okay and ways in which the system hurts us, fails to acknowledge trauma and abuse, ways that the system is violent and strips away our rights, those of us who end up worse off after experiencing services that are actually supposed to help us. And what I've learnt in recent years is that those messages haven't really got through in the places that they need to. So, and that needs, I think, to inform our work and how we move forward. So I talked about things like, I've come to understand that we often say, we're the people that use the services, we're like the customer, so surely what we say should matter most. Surely our voice should come first. And I could never understand until recently why it didn't come first. And what I've come to realise, and no individual person's ever said this to me, it's not about any person or profession, but the system as a whole doesn't see us as the customer at all. I think the customer is the general public, and we're actually the problem that the system's trying to fix. We're not the customer, we're not seen as the customer. And so that makes sense to me about why we're not listened to, because why would you listen to a problem? You just try to fix it, or get rid of it, or contain it, or control it. And so I think we have to shift that, because I think that is profoundly unacceptable. But it seems to me that's at the heart of a lot of things. And so related to that, I talked about, when we're in lived experience or consumer roles, the many harms and challenges we experience that are often related to us being the problem instead of the customer and the people that hold the most important wisdom about what's needed. And I've experienced many of those issues myself. So being exposed to trauma, sometimes on a daily basis, discrimination, profoundly offensive experiences. So I talked about being at a conference recently that was talking about violence in psychiatry, and it was an important conference theme, but the focus was mainly about, almost entirely about, when people like myself might be violent, rather than a conversation about the system itself is actually violent, a system that uses force and coercion and threat and restraints and treatments that can strip away our cognitive ability and our memories. That's actually violent.
And that was actually graphically displayed there.
It was. So, for me, a great example of that was that sitting right next to the tea and coffee table at this conference was a display of actual restraints, including great big banners with photographs of people who were restrained. And in a conference about violence, that was, I'll say, interesting. It was extremely offensive and upsetting, distressing for me. And I had to work out how to navigate that space over and over again for 3 days. And to think, how can we discuss violence and the main display be instruments of violence? Being sold.
You said part of that you believe that the consumers are the sort of the least influential in the mental health system. So who are the most influential and why, how do you shift that?
Yeah, look, I probably still don't fully know the answers to all that. It's something I've been really interested passionately interested in understanding. I do think consumers have the least power and the least influence of any other group that has influence in mental health. Obviously, the profession of psychiatry, is most senior and has enormous influence, not just for their professional roles, but also they're a very wealthy and powerful and high stature group of people. I think nursing unions have enormous influence as well. But there are many other groups. I think carer and family advocacy groups have a lot more influence than consumers because, and I'm not saying care and families experience lots of challenges themselves, but on face value, the public is much more sympathetic to the idea of people who are giving up their lives to care for others, and that's a good thing and a nice thing, whereas consumers are perceived as mad, not understandable and potentially dangerous. So, there's nothing to sympathise with us. So, we have very little power. I think the other big influence is actually, it's maybe not an influence, but it's an impact, is a profound lack of understanding of our experience. Is much more absent than I realised. I didn't realise that our messages really haven't gotten through.
What would you tell people if you have had the platform?
Yes.
What do people have to know?
People have to know that this system hurts at least as many people as it might help, and I would suggest possibly a lot more than it helps. That we violate people's rights on a daily basis in probably 1,000 different ways. And it's done, I thought when I started to work more closely with services and powerful systems that I would discover a whole lot of people who are really mean, and which sounds kind of naive, but I guess I just thought, how can these people hurt us? And they must be horrible. And it surprised me that almost everyone I've worked with has actually been a really kind person. What I've uncovered in the system is good people who are smart people and are trying really hard to do the right thing. There's been a few bad apples, don't get me wrong, some people who should not be in this space, but mostly it's good people with a good intent. And that makes it a bit harder, I think, for those people to hear the message that their work is doing harm. Because, how do people take that on board, that we're doing harm? That all the things we might have learnt at university about mental illness and about recovery and about treatment mightn't actually be right. So, one of the messages is for me is that the whole basis on which these things are predicated is kind of flawed, faulty logic. We take away people's rights based on things like risk assessments, and the evidence for those is almost non-existent. So I talked in my presentation something I'd learnt overseas from some research in Germany, that in order to prevent one assault by a person with mental illness that might be predictable, we have to forcibly detain and treat 304 other people who will never do anything to hurt anyone. In order to prevent one homicide that we might be able to predict, we've got to do the same thing to 4,220 something people. That's not acceptable. That's just not acceptable in any way, shape or form. We can't predict risk and danger, and also those of us who actually do dangerous things are a tiny, tiny, tiny minority. So how can it be okay to hurt so many? I think we have to question the whole foundations of pathologising human experience and calling sadness and fear and shame and anger illnesses. I think these are human responses, not illnesses. And for me, the heart is trauma. I know it's not 100% of people's experiences, but more than 85% of people who end up in psychiatric hospitals and psychiatric services have a history of profound trauma of many different types. It's not just one or two things, but we know 2/3 of people in psychiatric hospitals have experienced child abuse. And so for me, we don't need a mental illness system or a mental health system. We need a trauma system, and we need a human system and an emotion system and a justice system that serves what people need with no force whatsoever. That's what I hope. But to do that, I think the consumer movement has to find a way, has to find its own power, has to find a way that we can influence change, because what we've done to date hasn't worked. But we will find that.
And can it learn from other movements?
I think so. I think we have to learn from other movements, actually. I spent a lot of my time reading on other civil rights movements and trying to understand what was the point, what was it that happened that enabled these civil rights movements to progress when ours just hasn't, because our movement started at the same time as a whole lot of other stuff in the 60s, but we're decades behind other groups. And I think a part of that might be allies, that it might be harder for people to align themselves with mad people who are strange, but I think we have to find ways for people to hear our truth and our struggle and walk with us. I think that will be a key part of it.
What's the first thing they could do to do that?
To not be afraid to talk about madness, to read things. Oh, look, I'm not sure actually how to answer. What would be the best way? To question ideas about mental illness in particular. I know, like for example, one of the most common things I still hear all the time, even though it's been completely debunked and has no evidence whatsoever, is that mental illness is just a brain chemistry imbalance. And that's nonsense. There is no evidence to support that. But I know absolutely that there are still doctors telling people that. And there are still people walking around taking their medication in order to correct what they think is a chemistry imbalance. And that's a nonsense. So if we could start to have conversations about what might these experiences actually mean, could these be meaningful responses to things in our lives, maybe that's a way we can start to shift.
Thank you for another wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Indy.